Hi everyone, today we're going to be learning about section 10.4, solving equations in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. So yesterday we talked about working with quadratic functions and using completing the square to put them in the vertex form. So in this slide here I mentioned in the last lesson you found the vertex by completing the square. So here's an example of what we did yesterday. You were given a quadratic function, for example, y equals x squared minus 8x plus 7. And then when we solve this by completing the square and write it in the vertex form, it would be in the form of y equals, in parentheses, x minus 4 squared minus 9. And after we complete this, we can find the vertex, and the vertex is going to be 4 comma negative 9. Remember this x minus 4, this is the form of x minus h, so this is actually a positive 4 because of the vertex formula, and then my y would just be my k, my negative 9 here. In this section, in this current section 10.4, we're going to be finding zeros of a function. So we're going to be substituting 0 for y and rewriting the equation in the form of n squared equals k. And I'll rewrite it so it's all in one line, n squared equals k. So let's go on and do a few examples of this so this makes sense to you so you can see what we're talking about here. So what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to find zeros given this quadratic function, y equals x squared minus 2x minus 2. And so what we're first going to do is we're going to replace the y with 0, and then we're going to work with completing the square like we did yesterday, and then we're going to solve to find our zeros. Okay, so for y, I'm going to replace it with the 0. So I have 0 equals, x squared minus 2x minus 2. And actually, what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to rewrite it so that it's set up with 0 at the end. So I'm going to write it as x squared minus 2x minus 2 equals 0. So what we discussed yesterday is we need to work with completing the square. So we're going to look at our b. Remember, our b is connected with x, so that's going to be 2 over 2 squared. And when we simplify this, it's going to be 4 over 4. 2 squared is 4, 2 squared is 4, which simplifies to 1. Remember yesterday we talked about grouping the x's, so we're going to group the x's and add in this 1 that we just solved for. So we now have x squared minus 2x, and then we're going to add in the 1. That's part of the completing the square. But remember we talked about that value outside of the grouping, this minus 2 right here. I'm going to rewrite my minus 2, and then we subtract this completing square number from that outside value, that minus 2, and we set that equal to 0. So what we're doing is we're taking things a step further, but looking at concepts we covered in class yesterday. So when we think of this, what is negative 2 minus 1? That's going to give me negative 3 outside the parentheses. Let's rewrite that x squared minus 2x plus 1 inside the parentheses. All this is equal to 0. Let's factor out now x squared minus 2x plus 1, and when we factor that out, you're going to get x and x. Notice my symbols in here are negative and plus. That means I have two negative symbols inside there when I factor out. What two factors, what times what gives me 1? What two factors, when you add them together, would give me a negative 2? Well, that's going to be 1 and 1. So it's x minus 1 when we factor out this situation right here. So the way we can rewrite this is x minus 1 squared minus my 3 equals to 0. Now this is set up in the vertex form. We could find our vertex, and our vertex would be 1 comma negative 3, but we're wanting to find, they're asking us to solve and find our zeros. So what we want to do is, this goes back to section 10.1, 10.2, and watch what we're going to do. We want to figure out what the zeros are. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So on the left side now, what I'm left with is x minus 1 squared equals 3. But we want to get rid of this x minus 1 squared. How do I unsquare something? We take the square root. But remember, when we take the square root of one side, we have to take the square root of the other side. So when I take the square root of x minus 1 squared, I take the square root of 3 as well. So now I'm left with x minus 1 equals the square root of 3. Now when I take the square root of 3, it's going to give me a decimal. For tonight's homework, we're going to have more exact answers. So we're going to leave, since it's going to give me a decimal here of square root of 3, I'll leave this in the square root sign to have it be a more exact answer. So to find my zeros, to solve for my x, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Remember, when we're working with square root, it could be plus minus, so it's actually plus minus square root of 3. And we added the 1, and I'm going to erase this over here on the left. So to solve for my x's, solve for my zeros, let's set this up where we have x minus 1 equals a plus square root 3, and x minus 1 equals a minus square root 3 because of the plus minus square root 3. Add 1 to both sides. So for the first one, my x is going to equal 1 plus my square root of 3. For my second zero, adding 1 to both sides, so x is going to equal plus 1 minus the square root of 3. So what I just did is I solved for my x's, solved for my zeros, and so this x plus square root of 3 and x equals 1 plus square root of 3 and x equals 1 minus square root of 3 is your answer for this problem when we solved. Hi everyone, the last recording, the bell rang, so I'm leaving off in this slide, and one thing that we're going to be doing is we can also factor out a quadratic function when finding zero, solving for x. So let's go into the next slide and I will show you how to do this. So here's our example, solve x squared plus x equals 2, and we're going to be doing this involving factoring. And so when we do this with factoring, we're going to get this 2 here on the right side over to the left side. So I'll rewrite x squared plus x equals 2. I'm going to subtract 2 to the right, subtract 2 to the left. So what I'm left with here is x squared plus x minus 2 equals 0. And so what I need to do for this is I need to factor out x squared plus x minus 2 equals 0. So x and x we get for our first terms when we factor out. Notice my sign is a plus and a minus. So what kind of sign do you think I would put there for this factored situation? I'm actually going to put a plus and a minus. And we have to think of what two factors multiplied will give me 2, or negative 2 I should say, and when we add or subtract them together gives me 1. So obviously 2 and 1 are the two factors of 2, but we have to think of what's going to give me a plus 1 here. Well, a plus 2 minus 1 is going to give me that plus 1. So this is my factored out situation. So then I take each one of these, and this is review from another section. So x plus 2 equals 0. We're going to solve for x by subtracting 2 to each side. So we get x equals negative 2, or we do x minus 1 equals 0, add 1 to each side, and we get x equals 1. So for this, my zeros, my x's, x equals 1 or x equals -2. Here's another example. Example 3, solving x squared plus 6x plus 4 equals 0 by completing the square. So for this one, this is going to review what we covered yesterday and what you saw in a previous example also. So notice we have the quadratic function. It's set up in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. We're going to take our b and divide it by 2, and we're going to square that. So it's going to be 6 over 2 squared. And when we simplify that, we get 3 squared, which is going to give me 9. So I'm going to group my x's. So I'm going to have x squared plus 6x. That's grouped, but then we have to add in that value we just solved for completing the square for a perfect square trinomial by adding 9. Outside, we have our constant 4, so we have plus 4. Remember, now we have to subtract 9 and have that equal to 0. What is a plus 4 minus 9? That's going to give me a -5 for my constant outside the parentheses. Inside the parentheses, I have x squared plus 6x plus 9, and that equals 0. I need to factor out my x squared plus 6x plus 9, and when I factor it out, what two factors make 9 and add to 6? That's 3. I'm going to have x and x, both positives here, so we're going to have x plus 3, x plus 3. So that is now x plus 3 squared minus my constant 5 equals 0. I want to find my zeros, so I'm going to bring this -5 over to the right side. So I add 5, add 5. So I have x plus 3 squared equals 5. I want to get rid of the square. I undo that by taking the square root. So I have x plus 3 equals plus minus the square root of 5. Solving for the x, I'm going to subtract 3 to each side. So my final answer is going to be x equals a -3 plus the square root of 5, or x equals -3 minus the square root of 5. And that is my answer for this problem for completing the square and finding my x's, or my zeros, we say.